All right, we're going to talk to Mila, who pronouns are she, her, in Colorado, who says, would you consider calling trans women feminine men dehumanizing? I feel like this should be a really short call, but Mila, you are live on Transatlantic with Arden and Ben. What's going on?
Hi, thank you for having me. I guess I was curious. I've heard this like as a common criticism of like from gender critical perspectives that basically calling a trans woman a feminine man isn't dehumanizing. And as someone that supports trans people, I was curious. I think a lot of times we fall into a trap where like people who defend trans inclusion come from a ideological perspective, and the opponents seem to come at it from a like scientific perspective. And I was curious how we could combat some of these criticisms against trans inclusion from a scientific perspective that also includes, that doesn't like alienate allies of trans people.
Well, I mean, I think that I don't think that we don't come at it from a scientific perspective. I think what happens is the anti-trans position isn't updated on their science. They're claiming a scientific perspective that is way overly simplified and dumbed down and incorrect. Whereas we understand that science is complex and that you can't narrow it down to just the scientific perspective. So we include a humanistic perspective in with it. And as far as your question goes, yeah.
I was going to say, because identity is fundamentally biological. I mean, our brains aren't, they're not like ideological. They are fundamentally like biologically based. And one criticism I have of the gender critical movement is that they seem to acknowledge all sex differences in like all sexual dimorphic differences in men and women until it comes to the brain. And I agree that like we're not, it's not that the people supporting trans aren't doing it from a scientific perspective. I just mean that like the way that the conversation is framed, at least by kind of mainstream discussion, it definitely frames, they tend to strawman trans allies by saying that we are putting ideology over, the ideology of, well, if someone feels that way. Like,
I think part of the problem is exactly what you're talking about, is this sort of straw man thing where a lot of the people who are talking about, a lot of people have criticisms like self-ID, for example. I already know there's going to be like a portion of our audience who just groaned because they hate self-ID. But the problem is it's framed as this notion of like trans people are, doing an invocation where we're casting a spell with our words, that by the virtue of saying I'm a woman, that is what makes me a woman. When really what we're talking about is, much in the same way that you have to self-ID as right or left-handed, or self-ID as in pain, I don't have access to what's in your brain. And so the most reliable way for me to know if you're trans is for you to tell me that you are trans. And so it's not that the self-ID is what makes you a woman. There is some fact of the matter about our brain, about our psychology, our biology, and how those things are so deeply interwoven as a social species. That is the fact of the matter that makes you a man or a woman. And the fact that we can't point to a specific cluster of neurons is not a problem unless you also think that's a problem for the experience of pain and right or left-handedness or your favorite flavor of ice cream. All of those things are nebulous elements of, uncontroversially, our biology, our brain, our internal experience of the world. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about, the frauds going to the ice cream shop ordering vanilla just so they can get access to the little kids ordering chocolate. Like that's, not something you hear about on the news, but you do hear this about trans people in this like very fraudulent way. And I think, I think it really is kind of like you were both saying, this sort of out of date straw man representation of the trans position. We also we covered last week on the Hang Up when I was on with Matt, Sam Harris's recent podcast right after the election, where he talked about how it's a thought crime if you don't think that a trans woman is a woman, a specific one. And it's like, who's enforcing this thought crime? I would love to know, because I'm going to guess it's no one. And you're allowed to think anyone is whatever you want, because nobody gives a shit what you personally think. It's just we're saying like, hey, if you call me a man, I don't want to be around you. It makes me feel like shit, and it's rude and dehumanizing in my view. And when I'm around people who are aware of trans issues and aware of the facts of the matter, they treat me with respect and dignity. I don't need to know what they think about me personally in their head to know that like I'm treated like a human. I feel respected.
There's no scientific way to define the parameters of any word. You can't do a scientific experiment to say that this is the right way to prove that this should be the definition of a planet or a fish or a woman. So
and if you take that perspective, like we talk about many times, you would have to move the goalpost through infinity in order to clearly define woman or man based on biological characteristics, because there is no single definition that encompasses every person that would even fit the definition of cis woman. So
even I the definition
it's a straw man, but it's also the goalpost has to be moved unless you allow for self ID.
Right. And to bring it back to the original question I have, which is why would some proponents would suggest that we are respecting self ID by saying that you aren't a woman, but that you're feminine. You're just a feminine man because the biology that defines your biological sex should be the sex of your body, not, the sexually dimorphic characteristics of brain development, or patterns of brain development more specifically. So how do you think we could address that critique from a scientific perspective that demonstrates why a trans person would consider that characterization dehumanizing?
I don't know if there's a scientific way to frame that particular question of why somebody would think something is dehumanizing. I don't know if that's the right, because that is inherently a humanistic question.
Yes.
But I think that chasing them around with them moving the goalpost is a great way to get to a point of science that people often forget or just are not aware of. There's this idea that science is 100% certainty or near 100% certainty in something. And that's not the case. And medicine especially is not the case. A lot of times it is what is useful, what knowledge is useful. It is not this never ending trail of philosophy to the ultimate answer. Again, that's philosophy. There's a point, there's a fun exercise in saying, I want to know everything that is, I want to know everything that could be, I want to know all the possibilities. Science really, in academia, it can be like that, but that's their job, is to research. In medicine or in applied science, it's not the job. The job in applied science is to work with what you have in the reality that we have and to make, humanity do better. And so there's a lot of things that I'm okay not knowing the answer on. And that is standard practice to not know the answer. Some great examples are especially with laboratory testing of primarily upper respiratory infections. Even people get frustrated if their doctor doesn't order a strep test for them when they feel like they should have it. But in all honesty, for the majority of people that are above a certain age or do not meet other criteria, even having that answer, even if it's positive, does not mean you're going to get antibiotics. It does not mean we're going to go forward with a different management. Same thing, with if you had a cold, and there are how many different viruses out there that can cause a cold. I don't need to know which one you have, because I'm going to, either way, you're not getting admitted to the hospital. You're going to go home. I'm going to tell you to do the same exact things. You're not going to be around people. So why do I need that extra step of information? Sure, you could do it, but it's not changing anything. And it's the same thing with trans people. what is the next step to absolutely confirm that somebody has whatever in their pants? I don't think any of us are going to go in that direction. I don't think any of us are going to say you have to. I mean, some people are wanting to do that, but even so, you're going to have to chase them down in their moving the goalpost, because you'll say, okay, are you in favor of genital inspections before like sports tournaments? And a lot of them will say, yeah, we actually are in favor of that. Okay, but how are you going to capture the people that like have ambiguous anatomy or have anatomy that does not line up with their chromosomes? Because gender criticals will say, oh, but it's the chromosomes, not the anatomy. Okay, so then are you going to karyotype everybody? Okay, but then are you also going to make sure that they're like are you going to start gamete sampling everybody before they go on a sporting tournament? Or are you going to gamete sample everybody before you call them sir or ma'am? Like there's a point where it's not useful anymore.
Don't have gametes as well. Like it's such a silly way to define it, because then you're erasing the biological sex of people that don't produce gametes and are still clearly male or female. I do have a background in genetics. Is it okay if I speak to the chromosome, or kind of explain why the chromosome argument is kind of an example of like this overly simplified science?
Yeah, and I think Forrest and I talk about that particular thing a lot too.
Yeah, if you don't mind keeping it a little bit concise. I realize we talk a lot, Absolutely. But yeah, you can, sure.
Well, the genetic blueprint for operating as male or female is universally in all organisms. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep it concise.
Sure. No problem.
Half of every chromosome comes from a male and half of every chromosome comes from a female, whether the shape is X or Y. I think one thing that is often left out that people with a more genetic understanding of human biology find intuitive is that like genotype and phenotype are very universal. So just to make it concise with a quick analogy, it's like if someone puts in blue contacts, you're not saying that, oh, I naturally biologically have blue eyes. But if someone has a parent that has a blue eye and you're able to take medication that expresses the epigenetic plasticity in your genotype so that your eyes naturally turn blue, you could say it's erasing blue eye biology to deny that person now has blue eyes just because they have to take medication that expresses that particular phenotype. So the same process that produced gametes also shows that half of every chromosome comes from a male and half from a female. So it's very different from identifying as an attack helicopter or a cat, because people don't have half of their DNA inherited from a cat. It's a commonly oversimplified analogy, and it's why I would say that
that's
it's
an interesting argument. You provided a very interesting perspective, though, and I need to start using that more.
I really like that as well. So thank you for that, Mila. And I also think it's important to talk about like when they say, this erases like, blue eye biology or something, like why do we say that, something or an action or a person erases a group? Like usually we're talking about, it's kind of like a bit of a stolen valor kind of point. Like you are sort of undermining the oppression that people in this group have faced by doing something, right? So the implication is sort of that by adopting womanhood and adopting like female phenotypes, that we are somehow undermining the oppression that women have faced. But if you are a trans person who has experienced transition, particularly trans women, although this is totally relatable for trans men too, I'm sure, just in a very inverse way, like I started experiencing misogyny. Like I started experiencing the oppression that cis women have faced, right? It's not like it didn't go away. I just became a recipient of it. Like it didn't go anywhere for anyone. It just suddenly, now I'm being included in, being ignored in certain conversations and things like this. So it's the notion that anyone is being erased by us adopting like a female phenotype or whatever you want to call it is very silly and not evident at all. Like I understand where they're coming from, because there is like this sort of rad femme perspective of like viewing women as like the sex class that is oppressed by the patriarchy is sort of like this conception of it. And there is a lens through which using that, I think, is valuable, like especially when we're like looking at media and things like this. But to think that it applies universally for every individual that you're talking to is where this is a problem we encounter a lot as trans people. And I know it's like it's similar to the fallacy of composition, but Ben used the ecological fallacy, and I use it almost every week, where it's like things that are true at a population level don't necessarily work when you try to apply them to individuals. And it's something we keep running into. People think because this works in some context that it has to work in all contexts, and it just doesn't.
Right. I mean, you can still center the definition of biological sex on a species level around reproduction, but you could almost make the argument in reverse that you're erasing female biology when you deny the same biological mechanisms that produce the same phenotypic traits in a trans woman. And you say, well, that's not female biology. It's only gametes that are, biology. There are only gametes that produce biological sex. Biological sex isn't a single trait. It's a multitude of traits that tend to align in one direction or another. It's polar, right? But it's not necessarily a binary in that aspect. So you could make the argument that, when the same exact biological mechanisms are happening in a trans woman, to deny that that's female biology, you're denying it's female biology in all women when, in order to prioritize gamete production, just to like die on the hill of, we don't want to include these trans women. Again, you can center the definition of womanhood around reproduction, especially at a species level, and still expand the definition to include various forms of variations, the same way we do with intersex women. I mean, it's different variations, granted, but it still is a variation of the norm, carrying some male sex characteristics. So to deny it in someone who still is experiencing that female biology, to deny that that's female biology, that there's any aspect of them that's biologically female, I think just as easily erases female biology as someone who says that, oh, there's no such thing as a biological female.
I think that's why we call this also like the essentialist worldview, right? Like the biological essentialist, because they kind of think that that's all that matters. And part of this is actually kind of interestingly why I often will say that I'm not sure that, like, I feel like transsexual might be a technically more accurate term, because I feel like what's actually being transed is not my gender or my identity. That has been stable throughout all of this process. It has been like my sex characteristics that have changed. And I know some trans women are very comfortable just saying like, I am female. And I feel like I sometimes struggle with that, not because I necessarily think it's wrong, because I think it's just more complicated than that. But I absolutely think it's fair to be like, oh, like there's lots of, like, a lot of my biology is female. And like, maybe it's fair even to say that like female is more accurate than male for me or something like that. But it's, I think people want it. It's comfortable to have these hardline categories. Ben, sorry, you look like you wanted to jump in there too.
Oh, no, I agree with a lot of that. So.
Well, and you're ultimately saying that it's you're erasing the biology of the brain. I would say that's why I would consider it dehumanizing, because you're reducing all men and all women down to body parts and not acknowledging the part of the biology that, if someone did a brain transplant, took my brain out of my body and put someone else's in it, and then my brain was destroyed, I wouldn't consider myself to still exist. And if someone said that's still you because your body parts are all that matter, like, I'd find that to be pretty dehumanizing. I'd find that to be discounting the part of my biology that I actually experience myself through. So
that was so good. Mila, you just did the transporter argument and made it into a trans thing. I really like that. That was really good.
Some really good rhetoric today. I love it.
Well, and I think it's a really important concept to I don't think we have to necessarily fight gender critical ideology so much as we have to combat it with like a real scientific and still I mean, there's no science without some form of ideology, but like I think it's really important to kind of like acknowledge those criticisms, but still create a framework that includes trans women, and aspects of female biology that addresses those concerns, but still, includes everyone, all variations of biological females. And I would say that, again, it's not like someone who produces sperm can produce eggs. It's not like someone who is biologically male can 100% change their sex the way a clownfish can. But, to discount any aspects of biological sex that do objectively, phenotypically produce sexually dimorphic traits, from male to female, that's when you start getting into, I think a lot of harmful policy where you're forcing people that look like women or perceived as women have the same anatomy that can be raped by a man. So I don't know if raped by a man. I don't know, but like you're forcing them into men's spaces, men's prisons. I think there's important nuance that needs to be acknowledged there, and it can be done with acknowledging science in a way that affirms trans validity and identity, not necessarily, reduces everyone into body parts, in an objectifying way with like oversimplified biology.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this conversation, Mila. I think we're going to probably move on and take our next caller, but I thank you for calling in, and I got like two really good metaphors that I'm probably going to keep in my back pocket for the future. So thank you so much for calling in.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye. All right. So that was a great call. The transporter argument as like a dehumanize, like conveying the whole dehumanizing element of simplifying our biology down to our body, I think is so apt, because the skeptic community is so primed for the transporter argument. Fucking atheists love Star Trek. It is just like, it is in the code when you get your atheist card from, whatever conspiratorial billionaire fits your bill.
Hey, if you liked that clip, you'd love the whole thing. Hit like, subscribe, leave a comment, patreon.com/calltheline. That one sucked. Use it.